The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was measured in minutes. Not hours, not days, minutes. Among the most decorated and feared soldiers of the Pacific Theater, fewer than 1 in 3 would survive their first assault. They carried 70 pounds of pressurized fuel on their backs, walked toward fortified positions that entire rifle platoons could not breach, and understood something that the men around them often did not. They were not expected to come back. Their weapon was designed to guarantee enemy death, but the men who carried it knew something else. It almost guaranteed their own. This is not a story about heroes. It is not a story about monsters. It is a story about what happens when war demands the unthinkable, and ordinary men are asked to become the instrument of it. To understand why flamethrower teams became marked for death, we must first understand why they existed at all. We must go back to the problem that created them. By 1943, American forces in the Pacific had encountered something their training had never prepared them for. The Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved beyond anything Western military planners had anticipated. On islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, and later Iwo Jima, Japanese engineers had constructed defensive networks that seemed to belong to another century of warfare. Not trenches, but tunnels. Not foxholes, but interconnected bunker systems buried beneath coral and volcanic rock, reinforced with concrete and steel, designed not merely to resist bombardment, but to survive it entirely. Naval bombardment, which had proven decisive in European amphibious operations, accomplished almost nothing against these positions. Battleships would pour thousands of tons of ordnance onto an island for days before an invasion. Marines would watch from their transports, convinced that nothing could survive such destruction. Then they would land, and the shooting would begin from positions that appeared untouched. The problem was geometric. A well-constructed bunker with interlocking fields of fire could stop an entire company. Infantry could not approach without being cut down. Grenades were ineffective against deep positions. Rifle fire achieved nothing against reinforced apertures designed to deflect bullets. Artillery and mortars could not strike targets buried beneath 10 feet of earth and stone. The Japanese understood this mathematics perfectly. Their doctrine was not designed to win battles in the conventional sense. It was designed to make American victory so costly that eventually the will to continue would break. Every island would become a meat grinder. Every assault would be paid for in American bodies. The calculation was simple. If enough Americans died taking enough islands, perhaps they would negotiate rather than invade the homeland. Against this doctrine, American planners faced an impossible choice. They could accept catastrophic casualties in frontal assaults. They could bypass fortified islands and leave enemy garrisons intact behind their lines. Or they could find a weapon capable of doing what rifles, grenades, and artillery could not. They chose the flamethrower. The weapon itself was not new. Versions had existed since the First World War, used primarily by German forces against Allied trenches, but the technology of the 1940s had advanced significantly. The M22 flamethrower, which would become the standard American infantry incendiary device, could project a stream of burning fuel approximately 40 yards. The fuel mixture? A thickened gasoline compound that would later evolve into what we know as napalm, was designed to cling to surfaces rather than splash away. It burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. Against wooden structures, it was devastating. Against concrete bunkers, it was capable of consuming all oxygen within enclosed spaces, killing defenders through suffocation even when flames could not reach them directly. On paper, it was the perfect solution to the bunker problem. In practice, it was something else entirely. The men selected to carry flamethrowers were volunteers, though the meaning of that word in combat is always complicated. They were typically chosen for physical strength and psychological stability. The weapon system weighed approximately 70 pounds when fully loaded. This included 2 tanks of fuel, 1 tank of compressed nitrogen propellant, and the projection wand with its ignition system. A man carrying this weight could not run. He could not dive for cover quickly. He could not fight effectively with any other weapon while operating the flamethrower. Training emphasized that the flamethrower operator was not a lone wolf. He was the center of a team, typically 4 to 6 men whose sole purpose was to get him close enough to use his weapon. Riflemen would suppress enemy fire. A sergeant would direct movement. Another soldier would carry additional fuel and provide close protection. The operator himself had only one job: get within 40 yards of the target, discharge the weapon, survive long enough to withdraw. The theory was elegant. The reality was something that survivors would struggle to articulate for the rest of their lives. From the moment a flamethrower team began moving toward a fortified position, every enemy weapon within range would redirect toward them. Japanese defenders understood exactly what that silhouette meant. The two cylindrical tanks on a soldier's back were unmistakable, visible even through smoke and dust. And the Japanese knew with absolute certainty that if that soldier reached their position, everyone inside would die. Not might die, would die. There was no surrender from a bunker once the flames began. There was no escape from a tunnel system filling with burning fuel and toxic smoke. This knowledge created a phenomenon that flamethrower operators came to recognize in their first seconds of combat. They were not merely targets. They were the priority target. Machine gunners who had been firing at advancing riflemen would suddenly shift their aim. Snipers who had been waiting for officers would take shots they would otherwise never risk. Mortars would adjust fire. Everything that could kill would try to kill the man with the tanks on his back. The protective teams understood this too. Their job was not merely to support the operator. Their job was to absorb fire intended for him. This was rarely spoken aloud, but everyone involved understood the mathematics. If 4 riflemen died getting one flamethrower operator to his target, and that operator destroyed a bunker that would have killed 40 Marines in a frontal assault, the exchange was considered favorable. No one asked the 4 riflemen how they felt about the calculation. The approach itself was a form of psychological torture that no training could adequately prepare a man for. The operator would watch his protective team taking fire. He would hear bullets striking around him, sometimes striking the men beside him, and he could not shoot back. His hands were occupied with the projection wand. He could not aim a rifle. He could not throw a grenade. He could only walk forward, keeping the wand ready, waiting for the moment when he was close enough. 40 yards does not sound like a great distance. In combat, 40 yards is an eternity. It is 200 steps taken slowly, deliberately, while the world tries to kill you. Flamethrower operators would later describe the sound of bullets striking their fuel tanks as something between a ping and a thud, a sound that meant they were still alive only because the round had not penetrated fully or had struck at the wrong angle to ignite the fuel. Some tanks did ignite. When they did, the operator had approximately 2 seconds to release the harness straps before the fuel cooked off completely. Some men managed this, many did not. Their deaths were witnessed by the men around them, by the men who would be asked to carry flamethrowers in the next assault, by the men who would volunteer anyway because the bunkers still needed to be destroyed. When an operator did reach his target, the moment of discharge was almost anticlimactic. A pull of the trigger, a roar of ignition, a stream of liquid fire arcing toward the aperture of a bunker or the entrance of a tunnel. The operator would discharge in bursts, conserving fuel, directing the stream with a motion that survivors described as almost gentle, a sweeping gesture that looked nothing like the violence it produced. What happened inside those bunkers is something that both American and Japanese survivors rarely discussed in detail. The flames themselves were only part of it. The consumption of oxygen was instantaneous. Men who were not burned would suffocate. Men who tried to escape would emerge into fields of fire from American riflemen waiting for exactly that eventuality. The fuel would continue burning for minutes, seeping into cracks and crevices, finding men who had crawled to the deepest corners of the position. The flamethrower operator would watch this. He would hear it. Then he would withdraw, if he was still alive, and prepare to do it again. Japanese forces responded to the flamethrower threat with increasing desperation and ingenuity. Snipers were specifically assigned to target the distinctive silhouette. Machine gun positions were angled to create kill zones that flamethrower teams would have to cross. Some Japanese soldiers were designated as what might be called suicide interdiction teams, men whose sole purpose was to rush flamethrower operators with bayonets or grenades, sacrificing themselves to prevent the weapon from reaching its target. But the most common Japanese response was simply concentration of fire. Internal orders captured after various island campaigns reveal explicit instructions. Kill the flame soldier first. Kill him at any cost. Every rifle, every machine gun, every mortar that can be brought to bear must fire on the flame soldier until he falls. This created an almost paradoxical situation. The flamethrower was the most effective weapon against fortified positions, but the men carrying it were the most likely to die before they could use it. American commanders tracked these statistics with the cold precision that war demands. On some islands, flamethrower operator casualties exceeded 90%. Not over the course of the campaign. Per assault, 9 out of 10 operators who began walking toward a bunker never returned. And yet men continued to volunteer. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect to explain to anyone who has not experienced combat. They knew the statistics. They saw their predecessors die. They understood with a clarity that defies comfortable explanation that they were unlikely to survive. And they strapped 70 pounds of fuel to their backs and walked toward fortified positions anyway. Some did it for the men around them. The calculus was clear. One flamethrower operator could save dozens of riflemen. Bunkers that would have required frontal assaults costing 50 or 60 lives could be neutralized by a single sustained burst of flame. Men who had watched their friends die in futile charges against untouchable positions understood this with a visceral intensity that made the personal risk acceptable. Some did it because they had come to hate the enemy with a depth that frightened them afterward. The Pacific War was characterized by a brutality that both sides participated in, a cycle of atrocity and retaliation that stripped away the restraints of civilized warfare. The flamethrower was a weapon that matched that brutality. It was personal in a way that artillery was not. The operator saw his enemies die. He heard them die. For some men, this was exactly what they wanted. And some did it for reasons they could never articulate. Reasons that had to do with identity and purpose, and a strange form of pride in being capable of something that most men could not bear to do. They became specialists in death, professionals in a craft that existed nowhere else, that had no application to any peacetime endeavor, that would mark them forever as men who had done something that the world needed done but preferred not to think about. The Japanese soldiers who faced them experienced a particular form of terror that is difficult to convey. They were men who had been trained to die for their emperor, who had accepted death as the expected outcome of their service, who had demonstrated courage against overwhelming firepower. But the flamethrower represented something different. It was not merely death, it was death without dignity, death that stripped away every illusion of warrior honor, death that reduced a man to a screaming thing trying to escape its own burning flesh. Some Japanese soldiers, captured after surrendering in defiance of their orders, spoke of the flamethrower as a kind of supernatural punishment. They had seen what it did to their comrades. They had heard the sounds that came from burning bunkers. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Entire defensive positions would sometimes collapse after a single flamethrower assault, not because the weapon had reached them, but because the men inside knew what was coming and could not bear to wait for it. This psychological dimension cut both ways. American flamethrower operators returned from combat changed in ways that medical officers of the time were not equipped to understand. Some became withdrawn, unable to speak about what they had done, haunted by images and sounds that returned in dreams for decades. Others developed what might now be recognized as dissociative symptoms, an ability to discuss their experiences with a detachment that disturbed those who listened. A few seemed entirely unmarked by the experience, a phenomenon that disturbed observers for different reasons. What kind of man could do this repeatedly and emerge without visible psychological damage? The answer was usually simpler and sadder than it appeared. Most of those men were not unmarked. They had simply learned to hide their marks. By the time the war ended, the flamethrower had proven itself the most effective infantry weapon against fortified positions in the Pacific theater. It had saved thousands of American lives by neutralizing bunkers that would otherwise have required suicidal frontal assaults. It had shortened battles, reduced overall casualties, and broken defensive positions that nothing else could breach. This effectiveness is documented in cold statistics and after-action reports. What is not documented, what exists only in the memories of survivors and the silence of the dead, is the cost of wielding such a weapon. The men who carried it paid in ways that cannot be measured. They paid in life expectancy. They paid in psychological damage. They paid in a particular loneliness that came from having done something necessary that others could not bring themselves to even imagine. When they returned home, most said nothing. There was no vocabulary for what they had experienced, no framework that allowed discussion. They had been instruments of a policy that was strategically rational and personally unbearable. They had done what their nation asked of them, and they understood in ways they could never quite express that their nation preferred not to know the details. The flamethrower was retired from American infantry doctrine after the Vietnam War, replaced by thermobaric weapons and other technologies that accomplish similar effects at greater distances. The two-man teams that walked toward Japanese bunkers with tanks of burning fuel strapped to their backs passed into history. But for the men who survived, there was no retirement. The weight of those tanks never fully left their shoulders. The sound of ignition never fully faded from their ears. They lived out their years with the knowledge of what they had been capable of, what they had been asked to become, what they had done in those 40 yards between safety and the aperture of a bunker. They were not heroes in any simple sense. They were not villains. They were men caught in the machinery of a war that demanded the unthinkable and founded in ordinary soldiers willing to carry 70 pounds of fire into positions that no one else could breach. Most of them never spoke of it. Most of them took their silence to their graves, and that silence, perhaps, tells us more than any words could about the true cost of what they did.